what you're talking about, Dixie, is the idea of convert being used derogatorily. Like, oh, they're a convert. If that would be used derogatorily, then we're not allowed to say something to someone to hurt them. And if we're a convert and we're saying, oh, you used to serve idols and now you joined God's company, that would be a hurtful derogatory statement that we're not allowed to say. But when we're viewing convert as a beautiful title, meaning, wow, you chose to join God's flock. A Jew is born into it. A Jew can't ever leave it, no matter what they want. But you made a choice. You consciously chose to join God's flock. And that's why there's a special love that God has for the convert. So in that perspective, convert is not derogatory. Convert name that implies superiority. That's why it says that converts could be difficult for the Jewish people because they voluntarily joined and they're doing all these commandments out of love for God. And that's so precious. We might look bad in contrast.
Got it. Thank you. Thank
So
you.
it depends on how you're viewing it. Like
Yep.
here, this girl that made this little clip about her father, she was bringing out like how special it is that her husband is able to learn Torah all day because of her non-Jewish father who decided he's going to support him so he could do what God wants and learn Torah all day. So it was a beautiful testimony to her father and therefore to herself as a convert. It wasn't negative, but definitely it could be negative. It depends on the context. And if ever it's in a negative context, then it's criticized. And if it's in a positive context, it's something very praiseworthy. It's something very beautiful.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Very good expression.
Sure.
I know someone who uses it to explain his thick Scottish accent.
That could work too. So any questions now that I'm focused on marriage, or I know focus, but now that my son is engaged, so that's on the table with all the mazel tovs. Thank you. Anyone have any questions on the Jewish religious process in getting married?
That I actually have a good understanding of, right? At least a tolerable understanding of. What I've often wondered, and I mean often, is what in the world are our kids going to do when they want to get married? Because, especially in our case, we live in a very religious area, but it's a very Christian area. And so it's like, this is something that's been on my mind quite a bit, is what is the Noahide going to do?
That's actually a very,
Me too.
very real question. What I can tell you in the Jewish process, in the religious Jewish world, the going out is prearranged through matchmakers. A matchmaker doesn't have to have an official title. They could be a family friend. They could be a relative. They could be someone that knows both parties. In all three of my sons, and I have two married, I know this one that's engaged, the original idea definitely didn't come from an official matchmaker. And actually none of the people involved were ever official matchmakers. They were matchmakers. But I'm saying there were people that knew us and loved us or knew my children or, something along those lines, which of course you feel much safer than with someone who's just, it's their job. Not that I'm putting down anyone who it's their job. When you're going out, and going out is hard, of course, in the religious Jewish world, I think, not that I would know, but my speculation is it's actually easier than in the secular world, secular Jewish or non-Jewish, because in the secular world, as I understand it, you have to be friends for a while before you could even intimate that you're looking to get married. In the religious Jewish world, the two people are meeting knowing everybody was vetted here. Everything was screened. In theory, you're compatible. In theory, you come from a similar background and have similar interests and desires and goals in life, and you both want to get married. And the question is, do you want to get married to each other? And that's why in a relatively, to the world, crazy short time, couples can commit and have happy marriages forever. I mean, my husband and I went out 5 times. And then we got engaged 5 times in 2 weeks, and we got engaged. And thank God, been married for almost 36, not almost, about 35 and a half years. It doesn't have to be 5 times in 2 weeks. It could be more. It could be in a few longer weeks, but it's not going to be months and months and months. Just that's just not going to happen. You keep going out until you know you do want to marry this person, or until you know you don't want to marry this person, however long that takes. So it's sort of simple and clear. And this is all roundabout getting to Natalie's point. We know that you have what's called a bashert. Bashert means your soulmate, the person you're destined to marry, that you're searching for. You're sieving through the sand. You're sieving to find that pearl, that precious item, your soulmate. So I am sure every Noahide has their soulmate also. And even though you could say, well, there's 8 billion and how, you know what? We have to trust God. And I definitely think in the world of the Noahides, there definitely should be this concept of matchmaking, because you're in Boise, you're in, wherever, this place and this
There
place.
actually is. There's a group that's doing this, at least one group that I know of.
Oh, that's good news.
I don't know
And
how
God,
successful it is or anything.
as the years go on, the group will get larger because the Noahides have children who will grow up, and will obviously you want them to marry Noahides, or to someone who's open and appreciates and becoming a Noahide themselves. So definitely it'll be something. I do know a Noahide who sometimes joins us, and she's looking for a Noahide partner. And definitely we've tried to make contact with wherever we thought. Danielle, if you could send me the information for that
Yeah.
Noahide matchmaking group,
Yes.
in case it's not what I'm aware of, definitely reached out where I am aware to help this person, to find her Noahide soulmate. Because definitely if you're a Noahide, and then you're just in that vast secular world. It's like your soulmate is out there, but it's might be a lot harder to find. And definitely with the religious matchmaking concept, it makes things much clearer, much simpler. I'm not saying it's simple, I'm not saying it's clear, but it makes it clearer and simpler. Any other questions on anything to do with this process of getting married in the religious Jewish world, or how it applies to the Noahide world?
I would imagine that the rules about touching are basically the same.
There's definitely the idea of modesty and what's considered godly and what's considered immoral and non-godly. And definitely in a godly world, godly people abstain from any type of contact between a man and a woman until marriage. Obviously, in a Noahide world, what's considered marriage is different than in a Jewish world. A marriage could be a commitment to be husband and wife, as versus in the Jewish world where there's certain other ceremonial things that have to happen, as Maimonides actually discusses, the idea of what constitutes marriage for a Noahide, for a non-Jew. But definitely, yeah, there's that idea of fidelity in a relationship, the idea of being committed to a person, and the idea of not having contact before marriage is part of what is being considered being modest and moral and godly in your relationships. And the more modest and moral and godly we are, the more we bring God into the marriage. So Danielle merited to get married under chuppah with a ksuba, with a rabbi, my husband, who ordained their wedding. And he has not done it for any other Noahide, but I do know other Noahides have contacted him. So it never happened, practically speaking, that he actually went out there. But, that's a very, very godly way of bringing God into the marriage. Just like I know I had once a situation, in one of my other classes, a woman, so they're not, Jewish couple, but not per se religious. She was getting a little closer and she became very ill. And before she was ill, we had been discussing in class the idea of a Jewish marriage and the specialness of having a Jewish marriage, not just a secular marriage. And she went home and asked her husband, and he said no. Which I think is pretty standard for many husbands. Anyway, fast forward a year or so, unfortunately she got sick, and I raised the issue again. She raised it with her husband again, and this time he said yes, because of course he was trying to be very nice to her because she was very ill. And so he had no interest in this religious Jewish ceremony at all. He was just doing it to do something nice for his wife, who was very sick. And made everything. We did it in our synagogue. And my husband officiated, of course, and did the whole chuppah, the ceremony under the canopy, and I cooked the meal, whatever, It was very made by us affair. We had our friends over. It was very nice. And I saw after the ceremony and after the wedding, the husband, who was like totally not invested, was so happy. And he thanked me so much. He was so, so, so happy. And I was really surprised. I was touched. I was happy. I was a little surprised. Then afterwards, he told me this a few times. Then he was standing under that chuppah. He felt so incredibly burdened. His wife is very ill, terminally ill. So he has all of her care and her medical care on him. They had 2 children, and he's also now suddenly being the mother and the father for them. There's also a house to run, whatever that means, because his wife is not capable of doing anything now. And there's also the finances, both all the medical bills, and they lost about half their income because she's not working. So he felt incredibly stretched and burdened on every level. And he said when he was standing under the chuppah, as my husband was reciting the blessing, he felt God. That's how he put it. Not religious at all. He said he felt God come in. And he felt it's not just me and my wife. It's me, my wife, and God. And I'm going to make it. It's going to be okay. And that he said gave him a lot of strength for the duration of his wife's illness, was that sense of God entering. So there is something very special that happens when you do a marriage as God wants it, because you're really inviting him into the relationship.
Can I say that Jack and I did do that ceremony in Texas with Rabbi Katz, and we did get the certificate and everything. And it just, because the first ceremony is really it's not a, how do I want to put it? It's a shituf ceremony in a sense. It's not a holy ceremony. And we did that. We were the second to do it there. And it was just so awesome. Teresa and them, Mike, all of them did just a fantastic ceremony under the huppah. And Mike had just came back from Israel and he'd bought a huge tallit. And they used the tallit for the covering of the huppah. And he he had bought a white kippah in Israel, and he gave it to Jack, and he gave us the tallit afterwards. So every morning when Jack and I prayed, Jack would wrap me in that tallit, and we would pray every morning. At the end of all morning prayers, he would wrap me in that tallit. And it was the most special time of the day. It was so connected to Hashem to be wrapped in a tallit and morning prayers. But that's what we did. And we were so blessed to be able to do it, that God led us in that direction.
Wow.
It's wonderful.
It's really special.
So then could I ask
Really
the question,
beautiful.
Cyril?
Sure.
So in our case, that's exactly what we wanted when we got married. We were pretty young. We were 22, and my uncle was the officiant. It was outdoors. It wasn't in a church, but it was a very religious ceremony as best we could. We even had communion during the ceremony as us trying to show how important God was in our marriage. So then the question becomes, what, should we have another one?
That's an interesting question. I would call it your own feelings, because again, from a Noahide perspective, yes, I agree with you. That first, just like Dixie said, that first ceremony is drenched in what you don't want your marriage to be about. Not that you knew differently and not that you were coming from any negative place. It was just ignorance. But definitely that's not what you want as the foundation of your marriage. But according to Maimonides, if the Noahide man and woman commit that they are going to be man and wife and, come into this home together, he brings her into his home and they live together and they have committed to each other, that's marriage. You don't need anything else. So even if those origins were not how you want to, not how you're living your life, but the fact is, from a Jewish perspective, as Noahides, you are married. You are married by virtue of your marriage, by virtue of not that ceremony, but you're living together with this commitment to be man and wife. As we see, you have children, you're living a life together, you're married. So you don't have a obligation on God's part to have the ceremony with a chuppah, but it's a nice thing. So it's something you could think about, but it's not mandatory.
Can I add that? Sure. What we did was a recommitment to each other. It wasn't a remarriage. It was a recommitment to Hashem, as he was the only God, and the 7 Noahide laws. It was a recommitment to all that. It had really nothing to do with our past marriage because it was a secular marriage. And so for us, it was so special, so to be able to go under a huppah and to commit ourselves to Hashem, Ein Od Milvado, to only him and the laws.
There's some things that we leave to the realm of feeling. There's some things that God says, you got to do this. Now we got to do this. And if we don't do this, we try to work to do this. And there's some things that God says, don't do that. And we don't do that. And I think this is feeling, and I definitely like the way Dixie expressed it. It's not negating, because sometimes people think, well, I don't want to say like, my children until now weren't part of my marriage or this or that. It's not negating anything. It's exactly as Dixie expressed it, a recommitment to each other, a recommitment bringing God in a formalized way. But you definitely are married in God's eyes by virtue of the fact that you're married, that you're living together and building a family together. And according to God, that's 100% marriage for a Noach. And it's very important, of course, when one speaks to other people and tries to help other people come closer to God, it's really important to understand this morality piece, because of course our world gives very different messages. And it's very, very important to understand that God is saying how you're supposed to behave and what's appropriate and inappropriate in terms of relationships, men and women, like you said, touch, contact. And of course, nowadays, there's many things that the world says is okay if you want to do it. That God says, no, that is not okay. That is wrong. That is forbidden. That is not okay. So definitely there's a lot of people that just don't know. And don't know that God, really has a vision of how we're supposed to live in every level, including in our relationships, and how that really creates for us the most godly life possible, the life closest to God, and the best life for ourselves as people. Because if God tells us something we cannot do, that means it's not good for us to do it. He made us. He knows how we work. He knows how we're wired. If he says no, that is wrong for you, that means it's not only not good in God's eyes, it's actually not good for us as people either. So definitely in our world where there's so much confusion in these issues, so much gender identity confusion and gender relationships confusion, and things are so whatever you like, as long as you're not hurting anyone else in the process, so to speak, it's very good to have a very strong moral compass, a very strong moral barometer, and to share it with people who don't, because the world has sort of lost that, and it's definitely led to a lot of problems in the world and in people and in the relationships. But anyone else have any other questions on the religious Jewish way?
No, I love what you say about it doesn't take long to determine if you know, you both know you want to get married. Are you it? It's like my husband and I, we were so blessed. That's exactly what happened to us, and we were 17. It was like we didn't even have official dates. We were like sitting at the, tables at school and just kind of having these conversations. What, like, well, I like you and you're really nice. Well, I like you and you're really nice. Like, well, where are we going with this? And, we talked about religion and politics and finances, and we were 17, and it was like, yep, this is definitely the road we're going. We didn't get there till we were 22 and done with college, but it was like, yeah, this
That's
wasn't
nice
a hard
that God
decision.
made it so clear for you.
It was amazing.
That's a very big blessing from God that it was so clear. Very big blessing. As I'm saying, I see, even with our system, which tries to make things very clear, it's still, a bit of a road to figure it out. Though, again, a bit of a road could mean meeting 3 or 5 times, 7 times, whoa, to figure it out. But it's nice that in all the confusions of a secular world, it was so clear for you. Big blessing, very big blessing. Very happy to share with everyone my joy and my family's joy and my son. And yes, very, very happy. And again, he's marrying a girl from Israel, and they're going to get married, as it seems, before Passover in Israel. So I'll be able to be there myself in the land, and really, thank God. Appreciate all the blessings. I wanted to talk about in our remaining time was the same time as my son got engaged, or was getting engaged, is when we had this amazing, unbelievable rescue of these 2 hostages, Louis Har and his brother-in-law Fernando. And it was so amazing, so much to think about, so much to be inspired by. There was obviously tremendous joy. I think it was an outpouring of joy all over the world. Now, this happened on the 3rd of Adar, our new month, which the first was on Shabbos. And Adar is a time of joy. And this year is a leap year, which means we have 2 Adars, which means we have 60 days of Adar. So we have 60 days of this enormous joy. And actually, it's interesting because in Jewish law, certain items can be nullified if there's 60 times as much of them. Like if a little bit of milk falls into accidentally, only if it's accidentally, not if it's on purpose, accidentally falls into a pot of chicken soup. Well, if there's 60 times as much chicken soup to that milk, then it's still kosher. It's nullified. The milk becomes nullified because of 60 times as much from the other gender. So we say the same thing. The Lubavitcher Rebbe says that there's 60 days of Adar, 60 days of joy. It nullifies all negativity in this 60-fold joy of Adar. So here we had at the beginning of the month, I have the joy of my son and the joy on the 3rd of Adar of the release of these hostages. It was very interesting that both of them are originally Argentinians. And I really felt this was very strongly related, of course, who are we to know, but it seemed very strongly related to the president of Argentina visiting Israel literally at this time. And here we're looking at a situation which honestly makes no sense. The mission made no sense. It made no sense they went on the mission, and it made no sense at all that the mission could possibly succeed. They were going into an urban area. The area was completely booby-trapped. There were tunnels all over, so at any point, terrorists can come up with RPGs, as has been happening this whole time in Gaza. They were in a city. They had just then entered. Israel just entered this Gazan city of Rafah, completely not under Israeli control. In the building that they were going, there were armed terrorists throughout the building, and of course, armed terrorists in the apartment. So, in essence, it made absolutely no sense. It made no sense that they went in. It made no sense they succeeded. It made no sense that these armed terrorists didn't shoot the hostages before they were shot themselves. Like, it just doesn't even make sense. I remember listening to a hostage who was released in one of the exchanges, a woman who was, wherever she was in an apartment with herself and her, like, 3 children. And she said one of her fears the entire time was that the Israeli government, the Israeli army would try to rescue them. And you think, well, why would that be a fear? And her fear was because she knew there was all these armed terrorists in the apartment, and the second the Israelis would enter, they would kill her and her children. So she was like praying the Israelis shouldn't come to try to rescue me. Obviously, she wanted to get out, but she didn't want to get out in a rescue mission because she was like, no way we would survive it. And it truly makes sense. If every one of these hostages are guarded by terrorists, armed with their whole mission is to guard the hostages, how in the world did these 2 men get out alive? It doesn't make sense. The more you read about it, the more you watch it, the more you listen. I've done all of the above. It just doesn't make any sense. And I very much connected this, of course, with my Noahide slant, to this Argentinian president, who is, I'm sure, the most pro-Israel and pro-Jewish international leader that we have at the moment, who actually says he wants to convert to Judaism after he finishes his tenure as president, who's a student of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who loves Israel, who loves Judaism, who went to the Western Wall, who cried there, who prayed there so sincerely, crying for Israel, crying for the Jewish people. And everywhere he goes, the people are just rejoicing because they just saw who he is and what he feels for the Jewish people. And then he went to Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And it's very interesting because what is he doing in Yad Vashem? Well, he makes a speech, of course. He's at this Holocaust Museum and he speaks a Torah lesson. He speaks a lesson, literally, this is something Lubavitcher Rebbe talks about. I guess he was taught this, but so apropos. Here he's in a Holocaust museum, and what does he quote? He brings in the Talmud. This is his speech. He says in the Talmud that after the destruction of the Second Temple, the sages, including Rabbi Akiva, who was the greatest of the sages, went to the area of where the temple was, which of course is now destroyed. And they went, obviously they didn't walk too close. They knew the areas they were allowed to walk and the areas they're not allowed to walk. And they watched and they saw, like from a distance, the area of the temple where the holy was and the Holy of Holies. And then they saw foxes running through the area that was the Holy of Holies. And when the sages saw this, they started crying. And Akiva saw this, he started laughing, he started smiling. And the sages turned to Rabbi Akiva and they said, Akiva, why are you laughing? Why are you smiling? And he said, well, why are you crying? And they said, what do you mean? Look, here's the foxes. This is the Holy of Holies. We have foxes in the Holy of Holies. This is such hallowed ground that only one person, the high priest, once a year on Yom Kippur could enter into such sanctity. One person, once a year, the high priest on Yom Kippur. And now foxes are running around? He said, that's exactly why I'm laughing. That's exactly why I'm smiling. Because there's a verse, there's a prophecy that the foxes will run here. And there's also a prophecy that the temple will be rebuilt. And just as this was fulfilled, this will be fulfilled. And they said, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. And this concept is what this Argentinian president, we're assuming a Noahide, gave over. Here he is in a Holocaust museum. Well, that's the foxes in the Holy of Holies. That's the devastation of the Jewish people. But when we see that devastation, we know the other parts. The other verses will also be fulfilled. There are verses about the devastation, and there's verses about the rebuilding. There's verses about the exile, and there's verses about redemption. Just as this was fulfilled, this will be fulfilled. And this was his message to the world, this Torah concept. This Torah thought from the Talmud, flavored by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, this was the message he gave as a president of Argentina in the Holocaust Museum of Yad Vashem. So I thought, look at the power He's the president of a country. And that same night that he's speaking about the ultimate temple and the rebuilding, two hostages originally from his country, they both happen to be Argentinian, are freed in a crazy, miraculous rescue that makes no sense. As I'm saying, urban area full of armed terrorists, partnered with armed terrorists. Somehow they didn't kill the hostages. Somehow they all got away. Somehow nobody was seriously hurt. It's just insane. So what's the lesson in all this? I think the lesson is how much Noahides make a difference. That was a lesson I took, how Noahides really, really impact. And when Noahides recognize God, when Noahides turn to God, it makes a huge difference. It creates open miracle salvations. Somebody who was, I think, at some point the head of the Israeli intelligence said, even in the movies, they wouldn't show such a rescue operation. Why not? Because it's too implausible. Even in the movies, they're not going to show this because people will be like, oh, come on. Why are they making something so far-fetched? They just try to make it more real to life. Of course, movies aren't exactly real to life, but come on, a little closer to real life. So this rescue operation that wouldn't be shown in the movies because it's too implausible, they did in real life. And here you have the head of the country, who's obviously, as the head of the country, he's tied in with the spiritual energy of the entire country. And obviously what he did helped rescue two citizens of his country. So I really thought that this was a tremendous testimony, obviously to this person, but in general, to the power of Noahides. How Noahides really make a difference. Again, the two people that got rescued were Jews, but yet they were clearly helped by the Noahide president of their country, that his efforts obviously must have been tied into their rescue. The Israeli army afterwards said that they were planning this for weeks and weeks and weeks. Of course, don't know how they had the intelligence to know exactly where they were, but I mean, that's their department, not ours. But somehow they knew where they were, but how are they going to ever get them out? And they spent weeks planning this mission and waiting to get the green light from this one and the green light from this one, because how could someone give permission for such a mission? It seems like such a suicidal mission, suicide for the army involved and suicide for the hostages. And besides once, every other time they tried to rescue a hostage, which means they knew where the hostage was and they were coming trying to rescue them, it didn't work. They were never able to rescue a hostage. Besides once, much, much earlier in the war, they rescued one woman soldier, and that was it. And now, months later, they managed to rescue these two men. Clearly, it was a very, very, very strong impact from this Argentinian president. And I was very inspired by the power of Noahides to do exactly what Noahides are supposed to do, help the Jews of their area, of their country. I also thought it was a huge lesson how our spirituality creates salvation, because many, many things came out afterwards, of course, how the family, specifically the family of Lewis, was really doing spiritual things to really try to create salvation for their father. Now, putting in perspective that before this happened, before October 7th, this family was completely assimilated. They lived on a kibbutz. Very often, of course, kibbutzim are very often very assimilated. They knew nothing about Judaism. And the wife of Louis, Clara, who was also a hostage and was released, and his three daughters all took on very spiritual things to help their father. So Clara, the wife, with her daughters, was at a Shabbos meal. She'd never lit candles or anything like that before. And when she lit the candles before the Shabbos, she said she felt like she was getting a hug from God. And she decided she was going to continue lighting in her husband's merit to get out and to every week get this hug. And she lit for 4 weeks, and then he was freed. And also, very strongly, the week before this happened, all of his daughters had spent Shabbos at a Chabad house in the 5 towns of New York. They went to the Ohel and prayed there. And then one of the daughters and her husband flew to Florida to speak at a Chabad shul there. And they were speaking there to raise awareness of the issue that people shouldn't forget the plight of the hostages. And when they were speaking in this Chabad shul in Florida called The Shul, the audience, when it was time for questions and answers, said like, what are you here for? Like, do you want money? Are you fundraising? And they said, no, we're not asking for money. We came in for awareness. We don't want you to forget. And then they said, so what should Israel do? And they said, we don't know. We don't know what to tell you because there's no good options. Hamas is now demanding to exchange the hostages with terrorists and with the terrorists that were participated in October 7th. Sounds insanity. So there's just no good answers. Like, basically, they were saying, your money's not going to help us. We don't even know what we want the Israeli government to do. We just don't want you to forget our father. And then the Rebbitzin of the synagogue, who's Rebbitzin Lipsker, she said, listen, all is God. God wants us to do what's difficult. And she said to the woman, the daughter of this hostage, she said, if you could promise me that you will light the candles for Shabbat, for the Sabbath, for the Shabbos, and it's difficult for you. And in this merit, God should release your father. The woman said she would. And then she said to the husband of this woman, we will give you tefillin, phylacteries, if you commit to putting them on every day in the merit of your father-in-law. He's like, every day? Can I start in a week? And she said, no, you have to start tomorrow. He said, okay. And there was also a representative with them, and they also gave him the tefillin. And then the daughter said, can you give me a third pair? And tefillin, by the way, are very expensive. I said, why do you want a third pair? He said, well, I don't only want for my husband, I only want for this representative. I want to have a third pair ready for my father. So my father comes out, he can also put on the tefillin to thank God. And between the head of the synagogue, Rebbitzin Lipsker, and her husband, and the audience, they all chipped in and gave them 3 pairs of tefillin, which is a very big financial investment. So there should be this enormous merit of the tefillin that obviously contributed to his release. So I thought that was also very powerful for us to understand that how powerful we are, both as Noahides, tying in what the president of Argentina did, which was a clear demonstration of the power of Noahides, and from this angle, our power in adding in our service to God. We are powerful. We are incredibly powerful. Our commandments make a difference. And especially when we're doing commandments for specific people we love. So this tefillin, this candle lighting, the wife of the daughter, this created what you can only describe as an open miracle. And I think the lesson, the takeaway is for us. If we want to add in something we're doing for the hostages, for ourselves, for the people we love in our lives, we have tremendous power. We all have power. We all have enormous spiritual power, and that power makes a difference. And I don't know if anyone here has seen this, that they've taken on very specific things for very specific things, like they want a specific salvation, and for that they'd add in something, and they really saw it made the difference. Has anyone here had that they could look back and see it? How they added something very specific and for something very specific, and it actually happened exactly that way? I definitely have. Anyone else?
Yes, I definitely have.
Danielle definitely has. Anyone else?
I can think of one that sounds really silly.
Natalie has. Dixie said yes. Anyone else? Tanya, have you experienced something like that? I don't know if you're in a place where you could talk now.
Yeah, not really. No.
Not yet. Okay, God willing, you will. God willing, you will. It's very, very powerful because when it happens, you're like, oh my gosh, this really works. This is really powerful. We are really powerful, and our service of God is really powerful. And it really, really, really makes a difference. I think in general for people, and of course, definitely for Noahides, very powerful commandment to take on that God wants of us, that's very powerful, is charity. We're told charity creates enormous salvation, especially in saving from death situations. Like, of course, it's true with the hostages. It might be true in other people in other lives, if there's some significant concern. Charity is an enormously powerful commandment. Of course, as we speak of Psalms, Tehillim, Psalms draws down so much kindness and compassion. If we only understood what it was drawing down, we would definitely say more and say more and say more. And we can do it. I had in another class of mine, the woman was saying, I'll say this briefly, it's a long story, but she has one child, she's married, and she really wanted her daughter and son-in-law and their family to come closer to God. So she brought books of Torah study, the Midrash. She thought maybe her son-in-law would learn this, and through that he would become closer. It would bring the family closer. And she brought the books, but he wasn't opening them up. He wasn't studying them. He wasn't learning. He wasn't getting inspired. I mean, it's good they weren't in his house. Obviously, Torah books in your house are good even if you don't learn them. But she really wanted him to learn them. And she finally said to God, okay, listen, I'm going to do something for you so you get my son-in-law to open up these books and learn them. And she took on to say the afternoon prayer. She was already praying the morning prayer, but she took on to the afternoon prayer as well. And she said after 3 times of saying the afternoon prayer, her son-in-law called her and said, I want to tell you, I opened up the books and I read them. They're really interesting. She's like, wow. And then like a week later, they're like weekly on the Torah portion of the week. So they're per the week of every week of the year. After the Shabbat, after the Sabbath, he reached out to her and he said, I want you to know, I read the entire section for this week. It was fascinating. And I went to synagogue today with our son. He went to the Chabad synagogue near them. So it was very, very moving, very, very powerful, and obviously very connected to her saying, okay, God, I'm going to give you the afternoon service, and this is what I want from you. Now, obviously, we don't always see it as instantly as she did in this example, but we all have a lot of power. We all have a lot of power. And we should just know that every single one of us can create miracles for ourselves or for other people. We all literally have that type of power.